On today's World Insight, top contacts between China and the European Union amid complex challenges. Partners, competitors, or systemic rivals? What are China and the EU to each other?
And welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Chinese President Xi Jinping will meet with the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission, who are visiting China on July the 24th, according to China's Foreign Ministry on Monday. Chinese Premier Li Qiang and the two EU leaders will jointly chair the 25th China-EU Summit, with a focus on bilateral relations and global geopolitical challenges. The EU has long described China as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. But does that framework still hold today? As China and the EU enter their 50th year of diplomatic relations, what can we expect from the upcoming summit? And are their definitions of what they are to one another still apply? Time now to loop in our panelists. For more, joining us in Beijing, Wang Yiwei, Jean Monnet Chair Professor, Director of the Institute of International Affairs with Renmin University of China. In Athens, Greece, Vicky Price, international economist and former UK government advisor. In Berlin, Ulrike Bruckner, Professor with the European Studies of Stanford University, and also in London, UK, Ian Begg, Professor with the European Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science. The upcoming summit between Chinese and the EU leaders certainly attracted eyeballs around the world, especially with the backdrop of the U.S. trying to slash tariffs on most of its trading partners, including the EU, including China. Now, what about the overall nature of this relationship between China and the EU? Go to you, Professor Wang Yiwei, if you can. How is China looking at the relationship when it comes to the real nature?
Well, China-EU relations, I think, are still complementary as a partner. And under the certainty world, two players as a certain player. So we should cooperate to make sure the world is making progress, not backward.
The EU, on the other hand, we have noticed, has defined China as cooperation partner, economic competitor, and systemic rival. Now, certainly there seems to be, at least by words, imbalance between the two's attitude toward one another. So, Ms. Price, what is your take on this?
The relationship with the US is not looking very good for the EU, and of course the threat of extra tariffs are concentrating the mind very significantly. So there is no doubt that the EU is looking for other partners, trading partners. But there have been tensions, without any doubt, with China. And I think it would be really, really important if we can get some clarity as to the way forward. And I think for the EU, it matters hugely to have the ability to both export and import, as much as possible, as freely as possible, given the constraints that now exist with the US.
Now, Mr. Bruckner, Professor, tell me more, because China has asked the EU, quote, to change its mentality and properly handle divergence and frictions. Now, is the nature of how the EU is looking at the EU-China relations and look at China particularly likely to change or not with the dramatically changing global backdrop?
It depends on what we use as a starting point. We certainly have seen better relations, and we have certainly seen times that are not so fast changing and so pressing. So when we look at something like stable economic relations, we see a large potential. But when we look at geopolitical conflicts, everything is securitized these days, and that makes it extremely complicated to find common denominators that meet both sides' interests.
Go to you, Professor Begg. Do you see, with the summit upcoming, both sides is likely to move a brick or two away just to create an ambience? Or this is exactly the moment for both sides to show that they are playing hardball toward one another?
I think there is the beginning of a more constructive relationship going back to what we had previously. And the obvious explanation for this is the specter of something called Trump. both China and Europe are in the firing line for what Trump wants to do, as along with other parts of the world. And they'll be casting around to try to find answers to this, which is to try to revive the global trading system, which has been dealt many, many blows. You see this as well with the EU attempt to reset its relationship with the UK, obviously on a much smaller scale than with China, but it's an indication that the EU is looking for new ways of dealing with what I might call the Trump threat. And that threat is severe because it disrupts the Chinese economy and it disrupts the European economy. It's very important always to look at Europe not as a single entity, but to understand the tensions in individual countries, like Germany, where the car industry is severely threatened by the success of BYD and the other Chinese manufacturers.
Well, of course, every country has their own economic and trade advantage. They want to amplify that within the EU policy. That is an internal struggle, I guess, every country is working right now with Brussels. Having said that, though, Mr. Price, with a common challenge such as tariffs and the U.S. uncertainties, China and the EU could walk closer toward one another when it comes to trade. Do you see signs of it?
They certainly could, but the problem is, of course, that we have just seen a slight deterioration happening. The EU has put tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, for example. There have been restrictions in terms of investment and procurement in various areas for Chinese companies. We've seen the Chinese government itself sort of restricting a little bit some of the exports of rare minerals, and I think that's important. But there are a number of areas where that can certainly improve. And one that has been singled out has been the green economy, the fact that the two sides could cooperate a lot more than they have done so far, and they can find a common ground, particularly as the US is moving away from it. And I think there are huge opportunities there. The question is whether the summit will be able to explore any of that.
When you say future opportunities there in the green economy, which area are you specifically suggesting? Because EU's tariffs and also penalties on Chinese EV manufacturers was looked at in this part of the world as one step back away from its green agenda.
Well, one of the concerns and the reason for those extra tariffs, of course, is that there is some suspicion from the EU, and they are, of course, looking at this a bit more carefully now, about whether there are subsidies which are encouraging the production and then the import into the EU of those vehicles at cheaper rate than perhaps the cost of production. But nevertheless, I think what is happening is if you look at where the EU is going on the green agenda, they intend to spend an awful lot of money in this area over the next few years, sort of tens and hundreds of billions of euros. And it does actually need to be able to have the import of those, or the input, if you like, of those materials that are absolutely essential for this. So I think something that can perhaps improve that communication between the two, well, the region of the EU and China, I think will be really useful. I think there could be common ground there, in my view.
Interesting. Professor Bruckner, on green and beyond, do you see much opportunities that some of the tense areas of trade between the two sides can, in a way, improved somewhat?
We see a general securitization of everything makes it extremely difficult to use the potential. Because when you look at the green targets, the EU would greatly benefit from importing everything China produces on a very efficient and also cheap basis to meet the targets, starting from solar panels to windmills to everything the European Union cannot produce in a similar way. But a number of those productions are now looked at from the perspective of, is this a systemic risk? Is there a chance that we become dependent? And shall we rather change from an open economy and a competition-based system to one that uses industrial policy and protectionist measures for resilience? And that's a very contradictory discourse.
Yeah, we know that many countries and economies within the EU are also debating, depending on where their industries want to be. For example, Germany, France, Spain, and some of the other car producers. But if you look at what has already been done, EU/penalties 17 to 45.3% on Chinese EU manufacturers. Having said that, though, we see some of the Chinese EV manufacturers are already establishing manufacturing companies and also factories within the EU. So do some of the battery companies supporting EVs. Do you see that can be as a way out for the two sides? After all, those produced in Europe is made in EU. Professor Bruckner, briefly.
Well, it certainly is an opportunity, but it all depends on what we discussed before, that every country has a different perspective on what is the right strategy and what tools from the toolbox should be used. You will get a different answer from Germany compared with countries that are less dependent on car manufacturing.
But that's exactly the role of the EU, isn't it? The EU is supposed to correlate policies if it's not to complicate policies. That the EU doing that job well, the EU Commission and the EU Council, Professor Bruckner.
Well, the member states created the EU to speak with one voice, but until we form a common position, you will find a lot of disputes within the European Union, and that's not the EU to blame. This is the member states.
There has been complaints on the European continent as to how policies are being made within the EU, especially the EU EC, European Council, and particularly the European Commission. There were earlier accusations about the current head of the Commission not necessarily doing the communication well with various countries. That was accused by some countries. Now, we don't know whether that's true or not, but do you see the accusation about so-called the black box, how decisions are being made in Brussels, a question or not?
Well, it's always a question because you very often see the adjective unelected put before the European Commission. They're not elected by anybody, they're appointed. And there is a concern in Europe of what the academics refer to as a democratic deficit. There isn't a decision-making centre that relies on democratic input. But that's the way the EU has been set up. It's a technocratic entity. What it's not, and I often struggle to explain this, particularly to American audiences, is that the EU is not a federal level of government. It's a bit more than an international organization, but it's a long way less than a federal level of government, and its powers, therefore, depend very much on getting the member states lined up in the way that Professor Bruckner has already explained. This is an important feature of the EU.
Right.
It lacks the power to do things.
And by the way, the EU, the European Commission, for example, the European Council, are now writing its own story to define itself at a critical time, I guess. Professor Wang, to you, do you see the question I asked the other three panelists, also to you, do you see there is opportunity when the summit is approaching that both parties might want to, as a result of the summit, create some ambience and some of the tense trade economic area can be loosened up and eased up, but just a little bit to create a possibility? Do you see that at all?
Well, this is a 15 years anniversary of the China-EU diplomatic ties. So from the Chinese side, we need was summarize what we can get, benefit from the cooperation. So mutually benefit, and also the world benefit from the good cooperation between China and the European Union. However, there are many concerns over capacity, market access, the rare earths and the imbalance. All this because it's technically can be solved under different frameworks of the China-EU. We have 35 track of kind of negotiation. So this is a summit to talk about long-term and strategic relations.
It is a strategic moment. However, some of the detailed issues are certainly in everybody's mind. Just from the EU side toward China, earlier we talked about IPI being used in order to limit Chinese medical devices being bought in large size by the EU side. Also, the electronic vehicles, and meanwhile, sanctions on two small Chinese banks that are bordering with Russia, And from the Chinese side, we have seen restrictions of exports of pork, of brandy, and some export control of rare earth, which coincided, of course, with China's export control to the United States on rare earth. Both industries of China and the European continent to open each other's markets even more for one another. So all of these, do you see any sign that can change? Professor Wang.
China now, we volunteer to open, institutionally open high quality development. So that's what we can do. But European Union, with the so-called reciprocity, they need China open the market like the European Union do, actually is maybe unrealistic. However, they cannot make the excuse of the national security or because strong autonomy not to open to the market. And secondly, I think because of the free trade, WTO rule-based international order, given that this is the 80 years anniversary of the World War II and the UN, so we need to send the positive signal to not just to each other, domestic audience, but also to the world.
Let me just suggest a quote coming from the Chinese Commerce Ministry. Quote, view the economic and trade relations between the two sides without emotions or biases, with less criticism and more communication, less protection, more openness, less anxiety, more action, more discussion on everything, and less labeling. Will this summit set a good or at least a mutual example for that, Professor Bruckner?
When we look at emotions versus interests, you will certainly get something like a positive outcome because these are professionals and they know how to present it. On the other hand, there are structural differences, and these structural differences are not depending on emotions. China is neither a scapegoat nor is strategic autonomy of the European Union an excuse. And if we recognize this, then we might find a common denominator.
Very interesting, your comment, which reminds me of an important conversation we haven't had yet. That is the role of the United States and how the EU or individual capitals within the EU and European continent are looking at the potential and the nature of that relationship. Of course, one would expect, Professor Begg, the EU leaders are playing a very different role compared to the NATO leaders when it comes to the bureaucratic attitude. So how do you assess the European capitals, including Brussels, have been digesting all of this, and as a result of that, project what they believe as their best role toward the United States vis-a-vis its relationship with China?
Both the European Union as a whole and individual capitals are recognizing their vulnerabilities in two respects. The first is economic vulnerability, because stagnation in the European economy has become a feature. It's especially pointed in Germany, which struggled to readjust its energy mix to deal with the consequences of no longer importing Russian gas. But the military vulnerability is also there because Ukraine borders on European countries. And that security threat is seen as something which drives the concerns at European level, both about having to have greater strategic autonomy, but also thinking of ways to respond to the economic threat coming from Washington.
To you, Professor Wang, from China's perspective, how do you articulate Brussels' attitude so far vis-a-vis its relationship with the U.S. and as a result project some of that onto its relationship with China, even though China resents that, which China believes it can be a better bilateral relations between EU and China?
China sees European Union as a key and a crucial partner for the multipolar world and economic globalization. So China and the European Union should work together to resume the order of the post-World War II order, and not just any consequence or the technician concern to please President Trump at the cost of the relation with China.
Professor Bruckner, your thoughts?
Well, yes, we live in a growing multipolar world, and multilateralism would be beneficial for those who greatly benefited from globalization. But at the end of the day, a rule-based system will be decided whose rules will be applied in the new multilateral order. And that is an important point to discuss in more detail. And it's not just a question multilateral or multipolar.
But the question to follow up on that, Professor Buchner, is what were the rules that were earlier functioning since World War II? Whose rule is that?
Well, of course, we are still operating under Pax Americana, and Trump seems not to have fully understood that the existing order puts America in a hegemonic position in which they structurally benefit a lot. So by destroying the system and going to something like flexing muscles and imposing sanctions as he feels like, he increases uncertainty, and uncertainty is terrible for a trust-based system as our global economy is working on. If in the future we rebuild a multilateral order, we have, of course, to recalibrate it and include the interests of the global South. We are not living in the 20th century anymore, and we have to rebuild and to make the international order more functional. Otherwise, we will miss the opportunities that we have to fix the problems of the 21st century.
Very interesting. If I could, Ms. Price, read a quote coming from China's foreign minister when he earlier visited the European countries. He said both sides should join hands in addressing global challenges as climate change. And meanwhile, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission head, has been suggesting demonstrate the commitment and responsibilities of the EU and China to further deepen cooperation and jointly tackle climate change and other global challenges. So it sounds like what the other three panelists have been suggesting, there is hope there in terms of how the two sides, China and EU, would articulate when it comes to global governance and the world order, how both sides can contribute with the presence of the other. But do you think that can be this relatively strategic and rather abstract discussion be able to spill some happy beans to the other areas?
I think it's always possible. I think what we've seen in the world is that it has become a lot more protectionist, and that is a worry. That we understand the reasons for it. Some of them have to do with security issues and concerns about, particularly given the various wars that are out there, with ensuring that also rules are being followed, so there are no sales of products, for example, which are now completely contravening, is what I believe in the EU, some of the WTO rules. So we need to just make sure that there is transparency and everyone understands what's happening. If that is the case, I mean, I'm assuming one can keep one's fingers crossed that some of the geopolitical conflicts ease, then I see no reason why there shouldn't be some agreement and closer cooperation between the various nations to ensure that trade resumes the way it should do, because we all know that trade is seriously important for the world economy, and the fact that we've seen a reduction in the intensity of trade across the world has been bad for growth, bad for the economy, and I think it's been bad for the EU, and it's been bad for China, I'm sure, because free trade makes a huge amount of sense, and of course the expectations are that the US as well, with extra tariffs, will also suffer in terms of growth.
Right. There are several benchmarks, if I could mention that. First of all, this year celebrates 30th anniversary of the WTO since its founding. It has been an anchor in terms of global trade order, however, recently being much challenged, especially with this new administration in Washington. And secondly, this year also marks, as Professor Wang earlier, and some of you also mentioned, the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. Now, how is the United Nations moving forward, and how much will China and some players within the EU, together with EU, contribute to the future of the United Nations? And meanwhile, there has been the COP, there's going to be the COP30 upcoming in Brazil as well. So how much green agenda will be discussed? What roles are going to be played by which side? All these seem to be benchmarks. Now, I want to finish our conversation by asking some of you, do you see these benchmarks can be greatly taken advantage of in terms of China and the EU together? Professor Wang.
Well, definitely, as I said, that China and the European Union support multilateralism, and also as a certain power, we are against any uncertainty. And also, China and the European Union, we say, represents not just two players, two forces, two markets, but also two civilizations. So how will the human civilization will be towards? This is a very mutual concern, and also the concern for the whole human being.
Ms. Price, your thoughts?
Well, yes. I mean, we talked about green before, and I think this is going to be one of the major issues we need to sort out for the future, including, of course, thinking about technology a little bit more. There are going to be concerns about competitiveness in various parts of the world, and the EU is really intent on becoming more competitive in this area, but it cannot do it, as we heard earlier, on its own by any means. It absolutely needs to cooperate across, both in technology, but also in terms of materials that are needed and labor and everything else that we can possibly think of. And then, of course, be spreading some of those advances to the rest of the world too, because you can't do it in isolation. So yes, I think those are very, very important areas, and they should really encourage greater cooperation to happen. If everything else that we've been talking about in this program can be sorted out as well, of course, in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. Professor Bruckner?
Well, all of these events that you listed are designed to find compromises and solutions.
Yes.
And the challenges are so pressing that we shouldn't miss the opportunities.
Professor Begg?
The last word is indeed opportunities. The opportunities are there, but there's also a hidden threat which we're maybe not recognizing, and that is the US not just withdrawing its support for the global system, but also defunding it. I was in Geneva recently, and I sensed the lack of morale in agencies like the World Trade Organization, the International Labour Office, the World Health Organization, because they're seeing significant cuts in budgets. And if that happens as well to the United Nations, pillars of the international system are going to be undermined for financing reasons as well as political reasons. So we have to fear that.
All right. Thank you so much for the four of you joining us in this important conversation. We are looking forward to the China-EU summit. Maybe after that, we can come back again and see whether the list we provide to our audience worked or not. Thank you so much for the four of you. Thank you. Appreciate it. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel, follow us on X and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of the team, thanks for being with us, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.